January 23rd, 1942. 1400 hours. Combined Fleet Headquarters, Hashirajima, Anchorage, Japan. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood before the assembled staff officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier strike force, his weathered hands tracing circles on the tactical map spread across the conference table. Through the windows of the flagship Akagi's wardroom, the winter sun glinted off the waters where 6 fleet carriers rode at anchor, the most powerful concentration of naval aviation the world had ever seen. The Americans lost 4 battleships at Pearl Harbor, Nagumo said, his voice carrying the confidence of a commander who had just orchestrated the most devastating carrier strike in history. Their remaining carriers, Lexington and Enterprise, flee like frightened fish before our advance, and now they speak of building new carriers? He laughed, a short bark that drew knowing smiles from his subordinates. Let them try. It takes 4 years to build a proper carrier, and a generation to train the airmen to fly from it. By the time they launch even one, the war will be over, and the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere will stretch from India to Hawaii. What Vice Admiral Nagumo didn't know was that 3,000 miles away, at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Virginia, workers were already laying the keel of a ship that would become the USS Essex, first of a class that would transform naval warfare forever. The Japanese confidence wasn't mere arrogance. Their carrier force, the Kido Butai, had spent 2 decades perfecting carrier operations, while other navies still debated whether aircraft could sink battleships. At Pearl Harbor, they had proved it beyond question. Their 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, operated as a concentrated striking force with 414 aircraft. Their pilots averaged 800 hours of flight time, with many veterans of the China War logging over 2,000 hours. In the opening months of 1942, they swept across the Pacific like a typhoon. Wake Island fell on December 23rd. Rabaul on January 23rd. Darwin, Australia, received the same treatment Pearl Harbor had gotten, with 242 aircraft killed or wounded on February 19th. The British Eastern Fleet fled Ceylon after losing the carrier HMS Hermes, 2 cruisers, and dozens of aircraft in April. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial potential better than most of his colleagues. Yet even he believed Japan had at minimum 18 months, perhaps 2 years, before American production could matter. The Americans are merchants and engineers, he told his staff in February 1942. They can build cargo ships and automobiles, yes. But a fleet carrier is not a Liberty ship. It requires specialized steel, armor plating, aircraft elevators, catapults, arresting gear, and 1,000 other components that cannot simply be mass-produced. His assessment seemed reasonable. The United States Navy had only 7 fleet carriers when the war began. Japan had 10. Building a carrier like the Yorktown class took 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. Training the 5,000 crew members took another year. Forming effective air groups required years more. The Essex design that would shatter these assumptions had actually been conceived before Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese knew nothing of its revolutionary approach to construction. Where previous carriers had been built like custom yachts, each slightly different, the Essex-Class would be manufactured like Liberty ships, with standardized components that could be prefabricated in factories across America and assembled at multiple shipyards simultaneously. The Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company developed modular construction techniques that cut building time from 4 years to 20 months. Bethlehem Steel created new alloys that provided better protection with less weight. General Electric mass-produced steam turbines that generated 150,000 shaft horsepower, giving the Essex-Class a top speed of 33 knots, faster than any Japanese carrier. Westinghouse developed new radar systems that would allow American carriers to detect incoming attacks at ranges the Japanese couldn't imagine. But the true revolution wasn't in any single technology. It was in the production system itself. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who had built Boulder Dam and revolutionized Liberty ship construction, applied assembly line techniques to carrier construction. Components were standardized across the entire class. A radar antenna built in Massachusetts would fit perfectly on a carrier assembled in California. An aircraft elevator manufactured in Pennsylvania could be installed in a ship built in Virginia or New York. This standardization meant that instead of custom building each carrier, American shipyards could build them simultaneously, with components flowing in from factories across the nation. On December 31, 1942, USS Essex was commissioned, just 20 months after her keel was laid. The Japanese naval attaché in Switzerland, reading intelligence reports, dismissed it as American propaganda. No carrier could be built that quickly and still be effective. Yet Essex displaced 27,100 tons, standard carried 90 aircraft, more than any Japanese carrier, and incorporated technological advances the Japanese hadn't imagined. Her hull was divided into hundreds of watertight compartments. Her flight deck was armored with 4 inches of special treatment steel. She had 2.5 times the anti-aircraft guns of a Japanese carrier. Most importantly, she had been designed from the beginning for mass production. The Japanese first encountered the new reality on November 11, 1943, during the raid on Rabaul. Commander Takahisa Amagai, flying a Zero fighter from the base, recorded in his diary that night, "Waves of American planes such as we have never seen. They came not in the coordinated formations we use, but in massive, rolling attacks. Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, Dauntlesses, hundreds upon hundreds. Our intelligence said the Americans had perhaps 2 carriers in the area, but this was the work of at least 5 or 6. Where did they come from? They came from American shipyards that were now launching a new Essex-Class carrier every 2 to 3 months. USS Yorktown, the second of the class, was commissioned April 15, 1943, USS Intrepid on August 16, USS Hornet on November 29, USS Franklin on January 31, 1944, USS Ticonderoga on May 8, USS Randolph on October 9. By the time Amagai wrote his diary entry, 4 Essex-class carriers were already in the Pacific, with more on the way. The mathematics of carrier production told a story the Japanese military leadership couldn't accept. In 1942, Japan commissioned 2 fleet carriers, Junyo and Hio, converted from luxury liner hulls. The United States commissioned 1, the Essex. In 1943, Japan commissioned 1 fleet carrier, the Taiho. The United States commissioned 6 Essex-class carriers, plus 3 lighter Independence-class carriers. In 1944, Japan commissioned 1 fleet carrier, the Shinano, hastily converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull. The United States commissioned 7 more Essex-class carriers. Captain Toshitane Takata, a staff officer in the Combined Fleet Headquarters, wrote in a report dated March 15, 1944. The enemy's carrier production exceeds our most pessimistic estimates. Intelligence suggests they are building carriers at 5 different shipyards simultaneously. Each shipyard can complete a carrier in under 2 years. At current rates, by the end of 1944, they will have more fleet carriers than we have destroyers. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated what this meant in practical terms. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with 430 aircraft. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 58 included 15 carriers with 900 aircraft. The Japanese had spent 18 months rebuilding their air groups after the losses at Midway and Guadalcanal. The new pilots averaged fewer than 200 hours of flight time. The American pilots averaged over 300 hours, and their planes were new F-6F Hellcats, superior to the Zero in every performance metric. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe, one of the few experienced pilots to survive what the Americans called the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot, testified after the war, "We knew within the first hour that we were finished. Our formations were torn apart before we even saw the American carriers. Their fighters were waiting at altitude, guided by radar we didn't know they had. They attacked from above and behind, using tactics we had never encountered. Our younger pilots, boys with fewer than 100 hours in a zero, were shot down like they were flying trainers. 315 of our aircraft were destroyed that day. The Americans lost 30. The cascade effect began immediately after the Philippine Sea battle. Without trained pilots or carriers to launch them from, Japan could no longer project power beyond land-based aircraft range. American fast carrier task forces began operating with impunity throughout the Western Pacific. Task Force 38 under Admiral William Halsey included 17 carriers by October 1944. Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher operated with 16 carriers. These weren't separate forces, but the same ships operating under different commands, a luxury made possible by having so many carriers that they could rotate for maintenance and still maintain overwhelming superiority. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the battleship force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, reported to Tokyo. Enemy carrier aircraft are over us constantly. We counted attacks from at least 12 different carriers yesterday alone. Our anti-aircraft ammunition is exhausted. We cannot spot the fall of our shells because enemy aircraft force us to maneuver constantly. The pilots show no fear of our guns. They know we cannot reach their carriers, and their carriers are beyond counting. The psychological transformation within the Imperial Japanese Navy leadership was documented in a series of increasingly desperate communications. In January 1944, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, issued orders stating, "The enemy's carrier forces must be destroyed at all costs in a single decisive battle." By June, after the Philippine Sea disaster, the tone had changed. "We must preserve our remaining carrier forces and use them only when conditions absolutely favor us." By October, during Leyte Gulf, the orders reflected desperation. "Our carriers will serve as decoys to draw enemy carriers away from the landing forces." The idea that Japanese carriers, once the terror of the Pacific, were reduced to serving as bait for American carriers they couldn't hope to defeat, marked the complete reversal of fortune. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the decoy force, took 4 carriers north with only 116 aircraft among them. He expected to lose them all. He was right. USS Essex herself participated in sinking the Chitose. Her aircraft helped destroy the Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a staff officer who served on 3 different carriers during the war, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We lived in a dream world in 1942. We believed our spiritual superiority and tactical skill would overcome American material advantage. We calculated that even if the Americans could build carriers faster than us, they could not train pilots to match our veterans. We were wrong on both counts. Their pilots proved adequate, and their carriers so numerous that adequacy multiplied by overwhelming numbers equaled annihilation. The training revolution paralleled the production miracle. The United States Navy established massive flight training facilities in Florida, Texas, and California. By 1943, they were graduating 500 naval aviators per month. By 1944, over 1,000 per month. These pilots trained on actual carriers. The Navy had so many. Old pre-war carriers like USS Ranger and USS Wasp's sister ships served as training platforms. Escort carriers, built on merchant hulls, qualified pilots for carrier operations before they joined fleet squadrons. By late 1944, replacement pilots arriving at Essex-Class carriers had over 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in the specific aircraft type they would fly in combat. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to train any pilots at all. They had lost most of their veteran instructors in combat. They lacked fuel for training flights. They had no spare carriers for training operations. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, who joined a carrier squadron in September 1944, received exactly 60 hours of flight training total, including only 3 carrier landings before his first combat mission. He was shot down on his second mission and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. The intelligence failure went beyond simple numbers. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, admitted after the war, "We calculated American carrier production based on our own experience. It took us 4 years to build the Shokaku. We assumed it would take the Americans at least 3 years to build something similar. We didn't understand that they weren't building carriers the way we built them. They were manufacturing them like automobiles, with interchangeable parts and parallel assembly lines. The Essex-Class design itself revolutionized carrier capabilities in ways the Japanese never anticipated. The ships carried enough aviation fuel for sustained operations lasting weeks. They had repair facilities that could rebuild damaged aircraft between strikes. Their magazines could store enough ordnance for 15 major strikes without replenishment. Their crew spaces, while cramped by civilian standards, were luxurious compared to Japanese carriers, with air conditioning, ice cream machines, and laundry facilities that maintained crew efficiency during extended operations. Lieutenant Commander Masatoshi Katsuragawa, captured after his aircraft was shot down in November 1944, was held briefly on USS Essex before transfer to a prison camp. He later wrote, "I could not believe what I saw. The hangar deck was like a factory, with assembly lines repairing aircraft. They had spare engines, spare wings, even spare fuselages. Damaged aircraft were repaired or rebuilt overnight. The mechanics worked in clean uniforms under electric lights bright as day. They had hot food brought to them while they worked. On our carriers, we struggled to patch bullet holes. On theirs, they rebuilt entire aircraft between breakfast and lunch." By January 1945, the United States Pacific Fleet included 17 Essex-Class carriers in active service, with more arriving monthly. Task Force 58 could launch over 1,000 aircraft in a single strike. During operations off Japan in February 1945, American carriers launched strikes for 16 consecutive days, something Japanese naval planners had considered impossible. The carriers operated in groups of 4, rotating strikes so that Japanese defenders faced continuous attacks from dawn to dusk. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, wrote in his diary on February 16, 1945, "Enemy carriers appeared off our coast this morning. We scrambled every available fighter, 117 aircraft. The enemy shot down 90 of them. Their carriers remained untouched. We are like primitives throwing spears at battleships. The geometric progression of their power has exceeded our ability to comprehend. We speak of decisive battle, but there can be no decision when the enemy has 20 carriers, and we have none that can fly aircraft." The final revelation of American carrier production came after the war, when Japanese naval officers learned the full scope of what they had faced. 24 Essex-Class carriers were completed, with 8 more cancelled only because the war ended. The United States built more fleet carriers in 3 years than Japan had built in its entire naval history, but the numbers alone didn't tell the whole story. Each Essex-Class carrier was superior to any Japanese carrier in every measurable way: speed, aircraft capacity, defensive armament, damage control, radar systems, communication equipment, and operational endurance. Vice Admiral Nagumo, the same officer who had laughed at American carrier production in January 1942, committed suicide on Saipan in July 1944 rather than face the reality of Japan's defeat. His final message, found after American forces secured the island, included the line, "The enemy's material superiority has exceeded all bounds of reason. We are defeated not by their courage, which is no greater than ours, but by their infinite production of weapons we cannot answer." At a reunion of Japanese naval officers in Tokyo in 1960, retired Admiral Kiyoshi Hasegawa, who had served as a carrier division commander, gave a speech that included this reflection. "We entered the war believing ourselves masters of carrier aviation. We ended it without a single operational carrier, our pilots dead, our doctrine obsolete. The Americans built more carriers in 1943 alone than we operated in our entire history. Each one was better than anything we ever launched. We laughed at their early attempts at carrier operations. By the end, we could only watch in horrified awe as their carrier planes darkened our skies. The Essex-Class was not just a ship design, it was the physical manifestation of American industrial supremacy, and we never had a chance against it." Commander Okumiya, reflecting on the transformation from confidence to despair, wrote, "In January 1942, we joked that American carriers were hotels with flight decks, too comfortable to fight effectively. By January 1945, those hotels were launching more aircraft in a single day than our entire navy possessed. We had laughed at their softness. They buried us under the weight of their production. Each Essex-Class carrier was a factory, a fortress, and an airfield combined. They built 24 of them, while we struggled to convert passenger ships into carriers that lasted weeks in combat. The revelation extended beyond mere numbers to the systematic nature of American superiority. Every aspect of the Essex-Class program represented industrial and organizational capability the Japanese couldn't match. The ships used steam catapults that could launch heavier aircraft with greater fuel and weapon loads. Their arresting gear could recover aircraft faster, allowing rapid launch and recovery cycles. Their radar-directed anti-aircraft guns created defensive umbrellas that made them nearly impossible to attack successfully. Their damage control systems, with redundant fire mains, emergency generators, and trained damage control teams, allowed them to survive hits that would have sunk Japanese carriers. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most successful destroyer commanders, encountered Essex-Class carriers repeatedly during the war's final year. He testified at a post-war conference. Fighting them was like fighting machines from another planet. They never seemed to tire, never ran short of aircraft, never stopped coming. We would damage one, force it to withdraw, only to face another identical carrier the next day. Or perhaps it was the same one, repaired overnight. We couldn't tell. They all looked the same, fought the same, and there were always more of them. The story reached its final irony in the Japanese officers who had dismissed American carrier production in early 1942. Those who survived often found themselves, years later, standing on the decks of Essex-Class carriers preserved as museums. Captain Yoshimatsu Nakajima, visiting USS Intrepid in New York in 1982, told American veterans, "Standing here, I finally understand what we faced. This ship alone carried more offensive power than our entire carrier fleet at its peak, and you built 24 of them in 3 years. We thought we were fighting a nation of merchants. We were fighting a nation that could turn merchants into warriors and factories into fleets faster than we could comprehend. The mathematics that had seemed so favorable to Japan in January 1942 had reversed completely by January 1945. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet carriers and built 7 more during the conflict, losing all 17. The United States started with 7 fleet carriers and built 24 Essex-Class carriers alone, plus 9 Independence-Class light carriers, plus 122 escort carriers. The total, 147 carriers built during the war, not counting those already in service when it began. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, reflecting on the disaster years later, said, "We calculated that America might build 10 carriers during a long war. They built over 150. We thought carrier aviation was an art requiring decades to master. They turned it into an industrial process. We believed spirit would overcome material disadvantage. 24 Essex-Class carriers taught us otherwise. Each one was a floating testament to the fallacy of our beliefs. The Essex-Class production program validated every assumption American planners had made about industrial warfare, while destroying every assumption the Japanese had made about naval combat. The Japanese had won at Pearl Harbor through tactical brilliance and years of preparation. The Americans won the Pacific War through the systematic application of industrial power that transformed carrier aviation from an elite specialty into mass production warfare. Documents discovered in the 1970s revealed that Japanese naval intelligence had actually obtained accurate information about the Essex-Class program by mid-1943, but refused to believe it. A report dated August 19, 1943, stated, "Swiss sources claim Americans have launched 4 new fleet carriers this year, with 8 more under construction. This is clearly disinformation intended to damage morale. No nation could build carriers at such speed while maintaining quality." The officer who wrote that report, Commander Yoshiro Tanaka, survived the war. Asked about it in 1978, he said, "We couldn't believe it, because believing it meant accepting that the war was already lost. The mind refuses to accept realities that destroy all hope. That refusal to accept reality persisted until the very end. Even as American carriers roamed at will off the Japanese coast in 1945, launching strikes against targets in Tokyo Bay, some Japanese officers insisted these had to be the same ships counted multiple times. The alternative, that America had built an entire new fleet while fighting a two-ocean war, was too terrible to contemplate. The final accounting came at the surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945, aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Arrayed around the battleship were dozens of American carriers, including 12 Essex-Class ships. Admiral Halsey had specifically requested their presence to demonstrate American naval supremacy. Japanese Admiral Tomioka, attending the ceremony, counted the carriers visible from the Missouri's deck and stopped at 20. He later wrote, "Each one represented industrial capacity we could never match, training programs we could never implement, and logistics systems we could never create. We had started a war thinking carriers were weapons. The Americans taught us they were products, and the nation that could produce the most would win." Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had laughed in January 1942 at the idea of America building new carriers in time to matter. By the time those carriers appeared in overwhelming numbers, he was already dead, spared the final humiliation of seeing his confident predictions shattered by the reality of 24 Essex-Class carriers delivered in 36 months. What Nagumo didn't know, couldn't know, and refused to believe even when evidence mounted, was that American shipyards had turned carrier construction into an assembly line process as efficient as building automobiles, as standardized as Liberty ships, and as relentless as the mathematics of total war itself. The 24 Essex-Class carriers stood as monuments not to American courage or tactical brilliance, though both existed, but to something more fundamental, the transformation of war from a contest of warriors to an equation of production. The Japanese admirals who had laughed at American carrier prospects in early 1942 learned, ship by ship, battle by battle, defeat by defeat, that they had challenged not just a navy, but an entire industrial system geared to produce victory through overwhelming material superiority. The laughter died somewhere between the first Essex commissioning and the 24th, replaced by the terrible silence of complete defeat.